Marcus, and who is this lovely woman?
Oh, she just helps around the house. Good evening, boss. It's an honor to see you.
Thank you, Gerald. It's wonderful to see you too.
Marcus, Simone helped approve your promotion. What? What did you just say? It's true. She's one of our principal stakeholders.
I only hoped people would judge me by my character.
Simone Carter stood in the corner of a ballroom full of people who did not know her name, holding a tray of champagne glasses, were not hers to serve, wearing a smile that had taken every ounce of strength she had left to hold in place. 30 seconds earlier, her husband of 11 years had looked directly into her eyes, in front of 200 of his colleagues, and told them she was the housekeeper. Not a joke, not a slip of the tongue. He said it slowly, clearly, the way a man says something he has rehearsed. And the worst part was not the lie itself. The worst part was how easily it came out of his mouth, how natural it sounded, as if some part of him had been waiting years for permission to say it out loud. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Nobody in that room understood what they were witnessing. They saw a well-dressed man named Marcus Carter, rising fast at Simmons Holdings, introducing a quiet woman as hired help at his company's biggest night of the year. What they did not know, what Marcus himself did not know, was that the man walking toward them at that exact moment, the founder and chief executive of the very company Marcus worked for, was about to say two words that would end the evening as everyone in that ballroom understood it. Two words that would make Marcus Carter's stomach drop to the floor. Two words that would change the rest of his marriage. The CEO was going to call her boss, and he would mean it literally. To understand how a woman ends up serving drinks at her own husband's company party, you have to go back nearly 4 years, to a version of Marcus and Simone that barely resembles who they became. They met at a community fundraiser in Charlotte, North Carolina, back when Marcus was an ambitious junior analyst with a good suit and bigger plans, and Simone was the quiet woman running logistics behind the scenes, the one nobody thanked by name but without whom nothing would have happened. Marcus noticed her competence before he noticed anything else about her. She noticed his hunger, the particular kind that comes from a man who grew up watching other people's success from the outside and promised himself he would never watch from the outside again. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony that Simone planned almost entirely herself, down to the last folding chair, while telling almost no one how she paid for it. Marcus assumed, the way people often assume about quiet women who do not correct them, that her contribution came from a modest savings account and family help. He never asked directly. She never volunteered. It was the first small silence in their marriage, and at the time, it seemed harmless. Just a woman who preferred to keep her finances private, the way some people prefer to keep their diaries locked. Neither of them could have predicted how much that silence would eventually cost. What Marcus did not know, because Simone had never found a reason to tell him, was that she came from money that skipped a generation and landed quietly in her name through a grandmother who trusted her judgment more than anyone else in the family. It was not the kind of wealth that announced itself. There was no mansion, no luxury car parked outside their modest home in Charlotte. Simone had spent years being taught, deliberately and patiently, how to grow what she had inherited without anyone noticing, how to sit in rooms and say nothing while men twice her age underestimated her, and how to let that underestimation become an advantage instead of an insult. She had learned early that visibility was a liability, and privacy was a form of protection. Marcus, meanwhile, was climbing. He started as a junior analyst at Simmons Holdings, a mid-sized investment and property firm run by a sharp, soft-spoken man named Gerald Simmons, who had built the company from almost nothing over 3 decades. Marcus worked long hours, said the right things in meetings, and made himself visible to the people who mattered. He was good at his job, genuinely talented, but he was also the kind of man who measured his own worth by comparison, always glancing sideways to see who was ahead of him and who had fallen behind. That habit, small and quiet at first, would eventually become the crack that split his marriage wide open. In those early years, Simone made a habit of quietly supporting Marcus's ambitions without ever asking for credit, driving him to interviews before either of them owned a reliable second car, staying up late, helping him rehearse answers to questions his future employers would ask, sitting in the passenger seat while he practiced his handshake at red lights. She believed, the way people believe things they want badly enough, that a marriage built on that kind of quiet partnership would eventually be reciprocated in kind. Marcus told her often, in those days, that she was the reason he believed he could climb as high as he wanted to climb. He said it with real gratitude, and she held on to those words longer than she probably should have, long after his tone toward her had already begun to change. The first real sign of trouble came about 2 years into the marriage, when Marcus was passed over for a promotion he believed he deserved. He came home that night in a mood Simone had never seen from him before, sharp and distant, the kind of anger that does not announce itself but simply changes the temperature of a room. He did not talk about the promotion directly. Instead, he made small comments about their apartment being too modest for someone in his position, about her clothes being too plain for the events he was starting to attend, about how none of his colleagues would guess, just by looking at their life, that he was destined for something bigger. Simone listened and said very little. She had learned that silence often revealed more than argument. Over the following months, that pattern repeated itself in ways that grew harder to ignore. Marcus began attending more company events without inviting her, claiming they were boring, or work only, or not worth her time. When she did attend, he introduced her briefly, almost apologetically, and steered conversations away from questions about her work or her background. She noticed the way his eyes moved when someone asked what she did for a living, the practiced vagueness in his answers. She noticed, too, how he had started referring to their neighborhood as temporary, their furniture as something they would replace once things really took off, as if their entire life together was a placeholder for something he considered more respectable. Simone never confronted him directly about any of it. This was not weakness, it was strategy, though not the cold kind people imagine when they hear that word. She loved Marcus, or at least the version of him she had married, and she believed, the way people in long marriages often believe, that patience could outlast a rough patch. But she also began paying closer attention. She started noticing which colleagues Marcus mentioned with admiration, and which ones he dismissed. She noticed that Gerald Simmons, the CEO himself, was rarely spoken of with anything but careful, guarded respect, the tone people use when they are afraid of being overheard saying the wrong thing about someone powerful. What Marcus never suspected, because it never occurred to him to ask, was that Simone had quietly become an investor in commercial real estate over the previous several years, working through a holding structure that kept her name off anything public-facing. She was methodical about it, taking meetings during the day while Marcus assumed she was simply managing the household, reading contracts at night after he had fallen asleep. She was not hiding this from him out of deception exactly. She had simply never found a moment where telling him felt safe, and the longer she waited, the harder the truth became to say out loud, until eventually, the silence itself started to feel like the safest option available to her. About 8 months before the office party, Simone's holding company was approached about acquiring a minority stake in a mid-sized firm looking to expand its property portfolio. That firm was Simmons Holdings. Simone recognized the name immediately, and for a long moment, she sat with the decision in front of her, understanding exactly what it would mean to say yes. She could walk away from the opportunity entirely, protect the wall she had built between her private life and her husband's career, and never think about it again. Or she could move forward, carefully, quietly, the same way she had built everything else in her life, and see where it led. She chose to move forward. The acquisition process took months and involved almost no direct contact between Simone and Gerald Simmons himself, handled instead through lawyers, advisors, and a small circle of people bound by confidentiality agreements. By the time the deal closed, Simone held a significant stake in the company that employed her husband, though her name appeared nowhere Marcus would ever think to look. Gerald Simmons knew exactly who she was, of course, and he respected her wishes to remain unknown to the rest of the staff, including Marcus. It was, in a strange way, the first time in years that Simone felt truly seen by someone in a professional capacity, even though almost no one else would ever know it. Simone met Gerald only twice before the deal closed, both times in a small conference room far from the main office, both times with lawyers present and papers stacked neatly between them. Gerald was not what she expected from a man who had built a company from nothing. He listened more than he spoke, asked careful questions about her long-term intentions rather than her available capital, and seemed genuinely more interested in whether she understood the people working under the company's name than in how quickly she wanted a return. At their second meeting, he mentioned in passing that a rising analyst named Marcus Carter had been recommended for a senior role and asked, almost casually, whether the name meant anything to her. Simone paused only briefly, before answering that it did. She could have stopped the deal there. She could have asked Gerald to keep the information private, to proceed as though the coincidence had never surfaced, or she could have withdrawn from the acquisition entirely and let her husband build his career without her invisible hand anywhere near it. Instead, she asked Gerald a single question that would end up defining the following year. She asked him to evaluate Marcus exactly as he would evaluate any other candidate, without favor and without knowledge of her involvement, and to let the results speak for themselves. Gerald agreed, and true to his word, he never mentioned her name to anyone at the company, not even when Marcus's promotion was approved on merit months later. The company's annual gala was scheduled for early December, held in one of Charlotte's largest event spaces, the kind of night Marcus had been anticipating for months. He had recently been promoted to a senior position. A promotion he did not yet know had been quietly approved with input from the new stakeholder he had never met. He spent weeks preparing, buying a new suit, rehearsing small talk, mapping out exactly which executives he wanted to be seen speaking with. He invited Simone almost as an afterthought, 3 days before the event, phrasing it less like an invitation and more like an obligation he was fulfilling. She said yes anyway, curious, in a way she could not fully explain to herself, about how the night might unfold. On the evening of the party, Simone dressed simply, the way she always did, choosing comfort over spectacle, a decision that would matter more than either of them realized. Marcus, dressed sharply in his new suit, grew visibly tense in the car on the way over, glancing at her outfit more than once without saying anything. When they arrived, he moved quickly through the crowd, greeting colleagues with practiced warmth, while Simone trailed slightly behind, watching him transform into a version of himself she barely recognized, louder, more polished, more eager to be noticed by the right people in the room. The tension reached its breaking point about 40 minutes into the event, when a small group of senior executives approached Marcus to congratulate him on his promotion. One of them, a woman named Renee, who had worked at the company for over a decade, glanced toward Simone with polite curiosity and asked who she was. There was a pause, brief but unmistakable, the kind of pause that reveals exactly how a person truly feels before their words catch up. And then Marcus said it. He told them she helped around the house. He said it lightly, almost as a joke, the kind of comment designed to get a laugh and move the conversation along quickly, before anyone could ask a follow-up question. Simone felt something shift inside her chest, quiet and cold, though nothing showed on her face. She had spent years absorbing small slights from Marcus, learning to let them pass without visible reaction. But this one landed differently, deeper, in front of witnesses, spoken with a confidence that suggested he believed it entirely. A tray of drinks happened to be resting on a nearby table, abandoned by a server who had stepped away, and in a moment, she would later describe as pure instinct rather than plan, Simone picked it up and began circulating quietly through the room, refilling glasses, saying almost nothing, watching her husband continue the evening as though nothing unusual had happened at all. For the next half hour, Simone moved through the party unnoticed, exactly the way Marcus's comment had positioned her to be. She refilled glasses for executives who complimented the venue without looking at her twice, listened to fragments of conversation about quarterly numbers and expansion plans, and watched Marcus grow more animated, more confident, clearly relieved that the earlier moment had passed without consequence. He had no idea that every person he introduced her to, every colleague who glanced past her without a second thought, was unknowingly standing in front of someone who held more influence over the company's future than any of them realized. The room had no idea what it was looking at. It was nearly an hour later when Gerald Simmons finally arrived. He rarely attended the early part of these events, preferring to make an entrance once the room had settled, a habit everyone at the company had long since accepted as simply how he operated. He moved through the crowd with the unhurried confidence of a man who owed nothing to anyone's expectations, shaking hands, exchanging brief words, scanning the room the way he always did before settling into any real conversation. And then his eyes landed on Simone, standing near the edge of the room with a tray still balanced in her hands, and his expression shifted immediately from polite recognition to something closer to genuine surprise. Gerald crossed the room directly, without pausing to greet the executives standing near him, drawing curious glances from everyone close enough to notice. Marcus, catching sight of his CEO approaching, straightened instinctively, already preparing to make introductions, already assuming this was his moment to shine in front of the man whose approval he had chased for years. He had no idea that the moment was about to belong entirely to someone else. Gerald stopped a few feet from Simone, looked at her directly, and in a voice loud enough for the surrounding cluster of executives to hear clearly, said the two words that would end the evening as everyone understood it. He called her boss. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt, to everyone standing there, considerably longer. Marcus's smile did not disappear immediately. It simply froze, caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief, as his mind tried and failed to process what he had just heard. Renee, standing nearby, looked back and forth between Simone and Gerald with an expression of dawning realization. Other executives began exchanging quiet glances, the unspoken question moving silently through the small crowd. Gerald, apparently unbothered by the confusion he had just created, continued speaking, thanking Simone warmly for attending, mentioning briefly how pleased the board had been with recent decisions. Decisions everyone in that circle now understood she had been part of. Marcus finally found his voice, though what came out was thin and unsteady, nothing like the confident tone he had used all evening. He asked Gerald carefully what exactly he meant by that comment, forcing a laugh that convinced no one. Gerald turned to him with an expression that was not unkind, but was entirely without the warmth he usually reserved for his employees, and explained, plainly, that Simone was one of the company's principal stakeholders, someone whose support had been instrumental in several recent decisions, including, though he did not say it unkindly, Marcus's own recent promotion. He said it as simple fact, the way a man states something he assumes everyone already understands, only realizing halfway through the sentence that Marcus clearly had not understood any of it at all. The color drained from Marcus's face in real time, visible to everyone standing close enough to watch it happen. He looked at Simone, still holding the tray she had picked up nearly an hour earlier, and for the first time all evening, he seemed to actually see her, though it was far too late for that recognition to undo what he had already said in front of the room. Simone met his gaze steadily, without anger, without triumph, simply with the calm exhaustion of a woman who had spent years being underestimated by the one person who was supposed to know her best. She set the tray down gently on the nearest table and said nothing at all, letting the silence around them speak more clearly than any accusation could have. Gerald, sensing the tension but not fully understanding its personal weight, excused himself after a few more polite words, moving on to greet other guests, leaving Marcus standing in the wreckage of a moment he had created entirely on his own. Colleagues who had overheard the exchange began drifting away in twos and threes, murmuring quietly, some glancing back towards Simone with open curiosity, others avoiding eye contact entirely out of second-hand embarrassment. Renee approached Simone briefly, offering a quiet, sincere apology on behalf of everyone who had stood there earlier and said nothing, though she made clear the apology was not really hers to give. Simone thanked her simply and asked for a moment alone. Marcus found her 20 minutes later, standing near the coat check, already holding her bag, clearly preparing to leave. He tried to explain himself, stumbling through half-sentences about pressure and image and never meaning to hurt her, but the words kept collapsing under their own weight, because both of them understood there was no explanation that could undo what he had done. He had not made a careless joke in a moment of nerves. He had made a choice, one he had likely made in smaller ways many times before, to present his own wife as beneath him in front of people whose opinion he valued more than her dignity. That choice had simply never had witnesses before tonight. Simone listened to him for a while without interrupting, the same way she had listened to years of small comments and quiet dismissals, but this time something in her had changed permanently. She told him, calmly, that she was not angry about the money, or the ownership stake, or anything related to the company itself. She was not even entirely angry about the comment at the party, though it had cut deeper than he could probably understand. What she could not move past was the years leading up to it, the countless small moments where he had made clear, in ways large and small, that he was embarrassed by her, that he measured her worth by how she appeared to strangers rather than who she actually was. She told him she was leaving that night, not permanently in that exact moment, but enough to give both of them room to understand what had actually happened between them. She was not interested in punishing him through the company or using her position to make his professional life difficult, though she easily could have. That was not who she wanted to become. She simply needed distance, real distance, to figure out whether the marriage they had built could survive the discovery of how little he had actually respected her all along. Marcus did not argue. For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, he simply nodded and let her walk away. In the weeks that followed, word of what happened at the gala spread quietly through the company, not through any announcement, but through the natural momentum of 200 witnesses who had all seen at least part of it unfold. Marcus found himself navigating a workplace where his colleagues now viewed him differently, not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of careful curiosity that made every interaction feel slightly heavier than before. Gerald never brought up the incident directly with him, maintaining the same professional distance he always had, though Marcus could not shake the feeling that his position at the company, once built entirely on his own perceived merit, now existed under a very different kind of scrutiny. The change was subtle but constant. Meetings that once felt routine now carried an undercurrent Marcus could not quite name, a sense that people were choosing their words around him more carefully, watching to see how he carried himself, now that the room understood something about his marriage he had never intended for anyone to know. Renee, who had witnessed the exchange up close, made a point of treating him with the same professionalism she always had, but even her kindness felt, to Marcus, like something closer to pity than respect. He found himself replaying the moment constantly, not just the humiliation of being wrong in front of his CEO, but the deeper humiliation of realizing how thoroughly he had misjudged the woman he had built a life with. He began, almost against his will, revisiting old memories with a different lens. The night Simone came home late without explanation, which he had once assumed were nothing more than errands or time with friends. The careful, evasive way she answered questions about money, which he had chalked up to modesty rather than deliberate discretion. The quiet confidence she carried into rooms full of strangers, a confidence he had mistaken for simplicity rather than recognizing it for what it actually was. The calm of a woman who had never needed anyone else's validation to know her own worth. Piece by piece, the version of his marriage he thought he understood began to look entirely different in hindsight, and none of the new picture reflected well on him. Renee, in particular, found herself replaying that night more than she expected to. She had worked alongside Marcus for years, admired his drive, and had never once considered that the quiet woman standing near the edge of every company function might be the reason certain decisions at the top had gone the way they did. In the days after the gala, she found small excuses to speak with Simone whenever their paths crossed, not out of ambition, but out of genuine curiosity about a person she realized she had never actually taken the time to know. Their conversations remained brief and professional, but Renee later admitted to a colleague that she felt embarrassed by how easily she had accepted Marcus's version of who his wife was, without ever once asking Simone a single question herself. Marcus, for his part, began noticing the shift in how people treated him long before anyone said anything directly. Meetings that once flowed easily now carried a faint hesitation, a pause before colleagues spoke freely in front of him, as though they were recalculating how much of what he said could be trusted. He told himself it was in his imagination, that people had already moved on, but late at night, replaying the moment at the party over and over, he understood the truth clearly enough. He had spent years building a reputation on effort and image, certain that appearances were the surest path to respect, and in a single sentence spoken carelessly in front of the wrong room, he had shown everyone exactly how little he had actually understood about what respect required. Simone, meanwhile, spent those weeks doing something she had rarely allowed herself to do, sitting with her own thoughts without immediately organizing them into a plan. She had spent years building quiet competence into quiet power, careful never to let her private success threaten the fragile image Marcus needed to maintain. Looking back, she began to understand that her silence, however well-intentioned, had allowed a certain version of Marcus to grow unchecked, a version that measured love in terms of appearances and status rather than honesty and respect. She did not regret protecting her privacy. She regretted deeply how much of herself she had folded away to keep peace in a marriage that had never fully seen her to begin with. She stayed with her sister during those first weeks, in a small apartment across town, and found herself, for the first time in years, answering questions about her own life without editing the answers for someone else's comfort. Her sister had known about the holding company for years, one of the only people who had, and had never understood why Simone kept it so carefully hidden from the man she was married to. Sitting at her sister's kitchen table most evenings, Simone began to say out loud things she had never fully admitted even to herself, that some part of her had always suspected Marcus would react to the truth exactly the way he had at the party, and that she had built her privacy less out of humility and more out of quiet self-protection. Her sister asked her one night a question that stayed with Simone long after the conversation ended. She asked whether Simone had married a man who loved her or a man who loved the idea of a wife who would never outshine him. Simone did not have an answer that night, though the question followed her for weeks afterward, surfacing during quiet moments at work, during the drive home, during the long stretches of evening when the apartment felt too still. She began to understand that the answer mattered less than the fact that she had never once, in over a decade of marriage, felt safe enough to ask it out loud herself. She thought often during those weeks about the woman she had been before Marcus, the version of herself who had learned early that being underestimated could be turned into an advantage, who had built quiet wealth out of patience and precision while letting the world assume she was simply modest. She realized, sitting in her sister's small kitchen, that she had carried that same instinct into her marriage without ever questioning whether it served her there the way it had served her everywhere else. Being underestimated by strangers in a boardroom was strategy. Being underestimated by her own husband for over a decade was something else entirely, something closer to grief for a kind of partnership she had wanted and never quite received. Nearly 2 months after the gala, Marcus reached out and asked to meet, not to argue or explain, but simply to listen, something Simone had rarely experienced from him in the entirety of their marriage. They met at a quiet restaurant far from anyone either of them knew, and for the first time in years, Marcus asked her real questions about her life, her work, her decisions, without steering the conversation back toward himself. It was not a full resolution. Trust, once broken publicly and repeatedly in private, does not rebuild itself in a single conversation over dinner. But it was, for the first time, an honest beginning, built on the truth neither of them had been willing to speak out loud before that night at the party. Over the following months, they met again, slowly, carefully, neither one rushing toward a conclusion the other had not earned yet. Marcus began asking about the holding company, not out of curiosity about the money, but out of a genuine desire to understand the woman he had spent over a decade underestimating. Simone found herself, cautiously, letting him in, showing him parts of her work she had never shown anyone outside her own small circle. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first honest attempt either of them had made to build something real instead of something convenient. Marcus also began the harder work of examining why he had said what he said that night. Work that had nothing to do with winning Simone back and everything to do with understanding himself. He spoke eventually with a therapist about the quiet shame he had carried since childhood, growing up in a household where appearances mattered more than almost anything else, where success was measured entirely by what other people could see. He began to understand that his comment at the party had not been a single moment of poor judgment, but the surface of something he had been building for years, a habit of measuring his own worth through other people's eyes rather than his own. Gerald Simmons, for his part, never spoke of the incident again, though Marcus noticed a subtle shift in how the older man treated him afterward. Less like a rising employee eager to impress, and more like someone being quietly evaluated for the kind of character no promotion could fix on its own. Marcus took it as a lesson rather than a punishment, understanding that the respect he had been chasing for years had never actually depended on titles or introductions at all. It depended on how he treated the people closest to him when he thought no one important was watching. What happened to Simone and Marcus afterward matters less than what the story reveals about the quiet arithmetic so many people run inside their own marriages, deciding what to reveal, what to protect, and what to fold away in the name of keeping the peace. Simone spent years being underestimated by the one person who should have known her value better than anyone, and it took a room full of strangers, and 2 words from a man who barely knew her personally, to finally say out loud what her own husband had refused to see. It raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. How many people in your own life have you underestimated simply because they never gave you a reason to look closer? If this story moved you, let us know what you would have done in Simone's position, and whether you believe Marcus deserved the chance she gave him afterward. Stories like this one remind us that the people we overlook are often carrying more strength, more history, and more quiet power than we ever bothered to notice. If you want more real accounts of hidden strength, betrayal, and the moments that expose who people truly are, make sure you are subscribed so you never miss what we release next, because the next story we have for you might be the most unbelievable one yet.